They're coming in. Welcome, welcome. We're just going to give it a little bit of time so everyone can hop on in. Oh, it kind of slowed down there of the attendees. Maybe we'll start through too.
Sure.
Welcome to all those just popping in now. We're going to start in just about a minute. All righty. Well, welcome everyone to a history of campus style. We're so glad you can join us today as we look through photos and a few artifacts that represent how Wake Forest campus fashion has changed over time. We're going to go from about the 1830s, 1832-ish, to how far in the present are we going, Rebecca?
I stopped after the 1980s. Hold on.
All right, there we go. We'll get you through shoulder pads, we promise.
Yes, we stopped in the 80s.
The 80s, okay. Well, I'm Sarah Solom, the manager of community and academic learning at the Wake Forest Historical Museum here in the town of Wake Forest, North Carolina. Ed, do you want to introduce yourself?
And I'm Ed Morris. I'm the executive director of the Wake Forest Historical Museum here in historic Wake Forest, about 110 miles west of the campus, east of the campus. I can't get my directions right today.
And I am Rebecca May, Public Services Archivist in Special Collections and Archives here on the Renola campus. And welcome to everyone who's here. It will be recorded and we'll have time for questions at the end. So hopefully we'll answer all your questions about the fun fashions up to the 80s. I had to stop in the 90s because it seems like just yesterday.
It was too soon for you, too close.
Too soon as a college student from the 90s. I couldn't reflect.
I have pants older than that.
We'll do a small disclaimer before we begin. There are things that are going to be missing. This is not going to be a full comprehensive history of fashion, American fashion. It just couldn't be. But we hope it, encourages you to look at your old photos a little bit differently. Maybe it'll encourage you to go through the old yearbooks and check out some candid photos of students and just give you a little refresher course on how American fashion has changed over time. Rebecca, do you want to start the slideshow?
I am going to take myself off and start the slideshow.
All right, Ed and I are going to kick this story off with the 1830s. And we're going to start with, Rebecca, if you want to go to the first slide or the second slide, actually. We're going to start with the period of 1834 to 1865. So as you may know, Wake Forest College opened to its students for the first time in 1834. And I want to talk about the straight and narrow in fashion. I have here a portrait of Sally Waite, the wife of the first president of Wake Forest College, Samuel Waite. And Sally Waite, with her bonnet here, is showing us a staple of outdoor wear for women in the mid-19th century. Now, it's important to note that the bonnet represented the piousness with which women in the mid-19th century strove to. When wearing a bonnet, women could only really see forward, not side to side. So it kept their sight on the straight and narrow in the physical and metaphorical senses. Now, this bonnet that you see just to the left of Sally Waite is a leghorn bonnet. And we wanted to show you this photograph, even though it's not in our collection, because it speaks a little bit about Sally's interest in fashion. In the 1820s, while Sally's husband and eventual first president of Wake Forest College, Samuel Waite, was attending Columbia College in Washington, D.C., Sally began making these straw bonnets out of her home. She even hired young women to support her business and encouraged family members to sell them during their travels. Sally modeled her bonnets after much practice after these fashionable leghorn bonnets. The one that you see here is a leghorn bonnet, which was originally developed and became in fashion in Livorno, Italy. And the income that she made through her foray into the fashion industry bolstered the family's income and helped pay for Samuel's education. The photo on the bottom right is of Araminta Purefoy. Now, Araminta Purefoy was the mother-in-law of Professor William Louis Petit, so this might be important to note there. But Araminta's portrait, which probably was painted somewhere in the 1850s, is a good example of women's fashion in the mid-19th century. She's wearing a corset that was probably made out of steel, wood, or whalebone, probably wood. And it has her restricted and narrow waist. You can see she's tucked in at the waist, and then you have a full dome long skirt that we can't see here, but most assuredly just butted out at the hips, and then would have been floor length. You can see her tight sleeves are indicative of the 1830s and 1840s. Dresses were very plain during this period in the mid-19th century. You see a little bit of ruffle. By the 1850s, the sleeves started to become a little bit looser and wide open. I don't have a good photograph to show that or a portrait, but we'll see as we go on that dresses become a bit more extravagant with ribbons, braids, and cords as we go on.
Okay, Rebecca, next slide. There we go. Still in the same time period, we're going to look at some men's fashions. This is a photograph of students and faculty of Wake Forest College taken sometime between the early 1860s and early 1870s. The person you see in the foreground facing to the left of the photograph is Wake Forest College fourth president, Washington Manley Wingate. And you do notice that the men are wearing top hats. Wingate is sporting a top hat. The men's silhouettes during the period were very straight and fitted. An hourglass shape and tight pants would have been reserved for special occasions or more formal wear. In this photograph, Wingate is sporting a long fitted jacket and top hat. The top hats rose about 7 or 8 inches tall above the brim. And they were the style of fitting of the upper classes. Walking sticks were used as a gentleman's accessory, not as an aid to walking. And at the bottom photograph, you see the walking stick that was owned by Wake Forest first president, Samuel Waite.
So one of the more significant transformations in fashion we see in this next period between 1866 and 1900 is the introduction of ready-made clothing. So the sewing machine was invented in the 1830s, and commercial production of menswear really takes off in the 1850s. Not quite yet for women. We're going to get farther into the 20th century before women's ready-wear fashion becomes easily accessible. But ready-wear fashion really took off during the Civil War. During the war, the Union Army collected measurements of adult men, and these were used by clothing manufacturers after the war to create well-fitting ready-wear suits for men. And so with the advent of ready-wear fashion, as you look through Wake Forest College publications, we start to see more and more advertisements for department stores. In an issue published by the Wake Forest student, we learned that some alums are even getting involved in the ready-wear business across the state of North Carolina. In the October 1889 issue, for example, we learned that an 1879 grad had been acquiring over some period of time a stock of ready-made clothing in preparation for opening a department store. So here we also have an advertisement for Berwanger Brothers Department Store, which is in Raleigh and Wake Forest. And then we also have underneath that is an interior photo of a department store in Wake Forest, the Bolus Department Store. This photograph is from the 20th century, but it gives you an idea, if you can see quite faintly, just the clothes on the rack. And so I just wanted to nod to the department stores and the production of ready-made clothes. On the right-hand side, we have a portrait of Eva Bell Simmons, probably from the 1880s. Eva Bell, as you may know, was the first woman to graduate from Wake Forest College. She was the daughter of Professor William Gaston Simmons, and she joined school in, I believe, 1883 with her brother. At first, the trustees didn't let her receive her diploma, but she eventually was recognized for graduating from her class. But her dress here was most likely made by a highly skilled dressmaker or seamstress, so it wouldn't have been a ready-made fashion quite yet. The ribbons and decorations, extensive use of trim are characteristic of fashions in the 1880s. Her dress even has like a little modest bustle. You see the little poof in the back, and it speaks to the evolving princess line style of dresses, where it's going to be more fitted around the front and then just fall across your hips to the floor. I'm not sure what color this dress was, but I do synthetic dyes were invented in the 1850s and became increasingly popular in the 1870s. So we might see some pretty, if we saw this in color, there might have been some garish colors in this dress, but of course, I don't know.
The next slide. So here at the bottom, we see a photograph of Wake Forest students around 1890. By this point in time, suits have begun to loosen up for the men. Neckties have replaced the ascot or tied ribbons around the neck. Neckties also are beginning to get some color, brightly colored ones in some cases. Our photograph of the students, again at the bottom, shows that some of the men are wearing coats with waistcoats and others are without. The student portrait here shows that the higher cut jackets meant that the waistcoat had minimized its role in men's fashion and was about to become a thing of the past. If you look straight above, the photograph at the top left is Professor William Bailey Royal. During this time, the top hat for formal wear for men was being replaced with several new styles. Here, Professor Royal is pictured with his wife sporting a bowler or a derby hat. And then if you look over to the photograph at the top right, this is a group of businessmen on White Street in downtown Wake Forest. You notice that their clothing is much less structured. The suits are more casual. There's a alternative to the top hat and the bowler hat. The fedora is beginning to come into popularity. Fedoras are a far less stiff hat. They're much looser and softer. They're worn deeper on the head than the bowler or the top hat had been worn. Also during this period of time, the cowboy hat or Homburg style hats were quite popular. The cowboy hat was known as the JB for John B. Stetson. The Stetson Company was founded around 1910, and the hats in this photograph are not JB hats, but they are very similar on curl on the sides and the width of the brim. Today, trilby hats are often confused with fedoras, but fedoras are still around. We also have an accessory on the bottom right is the gold top walking stick given to Dr. W.R. Cullum by his fellow classmates in the Museum Society for being the valedictorian of the class of 1892. He did not need the walking cane to aid him in walking in 1892. He was a young man of about 21 years old. Oddly enough, some 50 years later, when he retired as professor of religion from Wake Forest College, they gave him a gold watch. Perhaps the two gifts would have been better suited, switched with each other.
So we're gonna stick around to the 1890s to the 1918 for a little bit longer. And I want to start with this photograph on the top here, a photograph of a mother and a son. While this photograph may be a bit hard to see, it is one of the rare photographs that we have of African-American families in Wake Forest in the late 19th century. This home might have been farther out from the college or just nearby, we're not really sure. But you can see that the woman on the steps of her home has voluminous puffed sleeves, which is very distinctive of the 1890s. You can see her skirt skims the ground, and it's a good example of the bell-shaped skirts that start to pop up during this period in the 1890s and help create an hourglass silhouette. You'll see that also her white top with the dark skirt. We're going to see that in the photo underneath as well, which is a scanned glass plate negative from the Powell family collection here at the museum. So when we see these white tops and these skirts, the 1890s were really a turning point in women's fashion. So the stiff look of the Victorian era was replaced by more casual wear and loose fitting wear for women. The ideal new woman, right, played sports and worked, maybe rode a bike. And so we start to see ready-wear fashion kind of take off a little bit during this decade, and we start to see menswear influence women's clothing. So this is evidenced by these white button tops, called tailor-mades, the shirt waist, the blouse, very similar to a man's shirt. And so I like both of these photos because you can see the woman with her puff sleeves, which speak to a little bit earlier in the 1890s, and then this photo on the bottom here, or maybe a little bit later in that period, but still kind of that shirt waist skirt, maybe wearing an apron when you're doing housework over that skirt. Mm-hmm.
And here we're still in the same time period from 1890 to 1918. This is a photograph of Ruby Reed. Big voluminous skirts of the 1850s and 60s were replaced by skirts that projected backwards. The bustle is one of the more recognizable features of women's wear in the 1870s. By the turn of the century, women's silhouettes had tamed a bit. The abrupt protrusion of the bustle was replaced by a more delicate draped back, as you see in this photograph of Ruby Reed. Lots of ruffles, pleats, and gathers on the backside of a woman's dress, while the front is rather flat and straight. Who was Ruby Reed? Ruby Reed was a well-dressed and savvy businesswoman in the town of Wake Forest. She operated an insurance agency. She was the first woman business person in Wake Forest. She also owned the first telephone company and operated it herself with some hired help as well in the town of Wake Forest. And her estate still today in the town of Wake Forest provides childcare for underprivileged children. Now, if you look up on the right, top right, you see some local women in furs. We also began to see some elaborate decorations in women's clothing. You see hats with feathers and fur coats with fur collars. Also, women were often seen, especially in cool weather, with big muffs, big fur muffs, as you see in this photograph here.
Just add those hats with the feathers. They just get me all the time. And I think if you look at the history of bird extinction, I think we're going to see that a lot of our bird population, right, those rare birds in decline with all these getting all these feathers for hats. It's an incredible story there. Sorry, just Rebecca, you can go to the next slide. Just those hats. We're going to jump to the 1918 to 1940 period. That is a huge period in fashion. But I'm going to label it the interwar period, and we're going to try to do our best to cover this really incredible period of fashion. So the top photograph is a postcard. It's a group of probably summer school students, faculty, students, residents, taken maybe just before 1920. It's not entirely clear. maybe 1919, but we start to see this flapper period, right? So what does that mean? We're going to see waistlines drop on women's clothing. Hemlines are going to rise up a little bit. If you see the high schoolers, this is Wake Forest high school class, senior class in 1927 on the bottom. You see ankles, you see knees, a few knees, right? So those hemlines are rising. And start to see bob haircuts, right? So some headbands, ribbons in the hair still, not long flowy hair necessarily. I also pulled this photograph of Ellen Lewis, taken probably about 1940. So the photo on the bottom right. Ellen Lewis was a well-respected nurse and midwife in Wake Forest. And so here you have a loose, belt around her waist, kind of natural waist, but still, it would have been a lower dropped waist without that belt there. Hemline up, right? Hair close to the head, nothing just around your ears. Ellen Lewis, though, so she's a good example of this period. She was actually interviewed in 1945 and offered some thoughts on producing clothing as an enslaved woman in Wake Forest. And she described the transition from handmade to ready-wear clothing and shoes. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about that. She noted that enslaved men, women, and children in Wake Forest produced all of their clothing, growing cotton, spinning thread, weaving, and sewing clothes. In the spring, she remembered enslaved people shearing sheep for woolen clothing. And while most of the clothing was plain, she told her interviewer that enslaved workers made cloth as colorful as that made by factories today, and certainly better quality. But she also remarked that this was really arduous and tiring work. And the enslaved community was required to produce clothing for themselves and for the white families on their plantation. And by the young age of 15, Ellen had gained a reputation as a very skilled spinner, a reputation that she noted only added to the tremendous burdens she already carried. And so it was really interesting to hear her perspective on fashion and the advent of ready-made fashion for women in the early 20th century, and then her experience making clothes as an enslaved woman in Wake Forest.
We have a little film clip here we're going to see. Rebecca, can you start that for us? You'll notice as we look at this film clip from 1939 that was made by H. Lee Waters, a noted filmmaker, made in downtown Wake Forest. Keep in mind this footage was done during the Great Depression, but you'll notice that while still some hints of formality, jackets, ties, the clothing is now looser, it's much more casual, it's much more closely related to what we see today. A lot of the men are wearing sweaters, not coats. They have soft collars. Some of the men do not have on neckties, but they're still nicely dressed, but still increasingly casual. If you notice the men as they walk down the street, the trouser legs have become quite wide. They're often cuffed, which had not always been the case. However, you're in the Depression. If you look closely at their shoes, you'll notice that their shoes are worn, and they're often wearing large and maybe sometimes showing the sign of age or wear large overcoats. This also shows Wake Forest as a bustling college town. You can get a feeling for what the downtown Wake Forest looked like the 1930s and 40s.
So this is going to be the last period we talk about until we hand the mic over to Rebecca, but the 1940 to 1956 period, a new look for women most certainly. In the top photo, we have a group of young people from Wake Forest College, mostly couples, and they're posing outdoors probably in around 1948. So like Ed mentioned, in 1939, we're starting to see more casual clothing in Wake Forest. During World War II and after the war, we start to see even more roomy, comfortable clothing. A few of the women here are supporting a loose coat over a dress and skirt, and that's going to be quite popular in the 1940s and early 1950s. Rebecca is going to show you a little bit more formal wear in the 1950s as well. On On the bottom right, we're going to see some ladies probably headed to a lunch date there by the depot here in Wake Forest. And this is probably in the during the World War II era, either right before, probably right after the war, probably right after the war. But they're wearing, you see, they're wearing suits. So the utility suit style came to prominence during World War II. A single jacket and matching skirt could be worn with a variety of different blouses. You could wear the skirt without the jacket. You know, you have options. This made sense during World War II when there was some rationing of textiles. But women's suits remained quite fashionable throughout the 1950s. As far as silhouettes, you know, we've talked a little bit here and there about the bustle and the princess line. You can't, these women they're hiding their waist with their jackets, but the suit jacket pretty much stopped at the waist. So it hit the widest part of a woman's hips, making a pretty natural looking silhouette for most women. I just loved this photograph on the bottom, the lowest photo of these young men and women dancing at a party at Kappa Sigma fraternity. And although you can't really see their clothing that well, you can see that the woman right in front, she's wearing a suit jacket, right? She's wearing a utility jacket. So they're partying, they're having a lovely time. And when we think of 1950s, we maybe think of that, you know, big poof skirt, the hourglass silhouette, perhaps at a 1950s party, lots of tulle, maybe like the dress that's behind Ed's shoulder, if you can see that. But no, here we have in the post-war period, women at a party wearing a utility suit. So I just love that photo, and I want to share that with you as well. Rebecca, do you want to take us to the second half of the 50s?
I would love to. Can you all hear me?
Mhm.
I'm going to stay not on video just so that you don't have to see me read and you can just look at the pictures.
Okay.
Oh, Mika has raised her hand. Hold on. Let me see if I can get to. In a web. Okay. Just letting you know we could hear you. Oh, good. Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Mika. Yes, you can hear me. All right, let me go back to presenting my screen. Share screen, campus style. Okay. So the 1950s were about elegance, formality, and perfectly matched accessories. As I go through the remaining slides, I do want to credit the FIT Fashion History Timeline, from which I am quoting heavily. I have the link at the end, and I'm happy to share it with you. It was really helpful in sort of tracking the trends and understanding what was going on in fashion. I am not a fashionista, so I know what I see, but it's nice to hear some behind it. So fashion in the 1950s saw a clear gender divide. While men and boys fashion moved towards a more casual day-to-day style, women and girls fashion prioritized elegance, formality, and perfectly matched accessories. Though it became increasingly acceptable for women to wear slacks for some occasions, overall the fashion mood in the 50s leaned towards femininity and formality. No matter what time of day throughout the decade, it was exceedingly important that a woman be impeccably turned out. This meant perfectly groomed hair, spotless makeup, and sets of matching accessories. In this picture, you'll see Anne Hedgepath. She's the one on all the way on the top right. She was Miss Demon Deacon. These are all images from the 1959 Howler yearbook. So you can see her matching suit, not quite the sport utility type suit. This is a little bit more refined. On the left, you see Peggy Kreiner, Miss Greek Week, and at the bottom, you see the 1958 Magnolia Court. What's great about the archives here is, and with Wake Forest, is although there were trends happening and people around the country and around the world were following different trends, there were also trends being set by the social standards of Wake Forest. So you can see here hats and heels are worn to Sunday morning church services. However, hats are not generally worn to athletic events. Casualness is preferable for class, although casualness then and casualness now might not be the same. For shopping trips to town, hose are worn. At formal dances and banquets, long and short formal are acceptable. And party dresses, sunbathing is only done on the decks of the parlor. And of course, raincoats, boots, and substantial umbrella. The raincoats come into play, and you'll see as I go through this, Bermuda shorts really were a hot topic. They may be worn in the phone booths, drive-in movies, or miniature golf course, though through the small parlor when leaving and entering the dorm, to and from a car, on picnics, swimming, and the recreation room, and to the farmer's dairy barn. But on Sundays, of course, Bermudas may be worn on Sundays with raincoats. So you had to wear your raincoat over your Bermudas on Sundays. And then they're not worn at all to campus, to classes, meals, movies in town, eating, and so forth. And you can see as things go on, you're not to carry on conversations. That's not so much the dress code, but more the etiquette. So we have a little bit more about Bermudas, but they come up more and more as dress codes change. And then you'll see some pictures as well. So accessories, fashion in the 60s. So this is the 50s into the 60s. Fashion in the 60s became progressively more casual across all genders and ages. Women's wear followed three broad trends: a continuation of the previous decade's ladylike elegance, the youthful styles of Mary Quant and the space age influence, and the late 1960s hippie style. Based on the photos and the dress codes that we'll go through here at Wake Forest College in the 60s, the trend was definitely a continuation of the previous decade's ladylike elegance. In the early years of the decade, fashion continued along the lines of the 1950s. Skirt suits and coordinating accessories were emphasized as one decade transitioned into the next. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy epitomized this look during her husband's presidential campaign and short presidency. She was admired around the world for her put-together ladylike look consisting of boxy skirt suits, sheath and A-line dresses, and luxurious coats, all accessorized with white gloves, pearls, and a matching hat. So the next few slides, we're going to look at a bunch of accessories. These typically are images from commencement programs through the 60s. So you see here, lots of pearls, lots of gloves, lots of hats, great glasses. And then if you didn't have a hat to keep you cool, a commencement diploma would do the job as well, as she's holding behind her head. Even the children were perfectly accessorized. As you can see in the left, this young woman in a pillbox hat and matching purse, some more beautiful hats. And just the quad during graduation exercises in this time period. Menswear in the 1960s was becoming more casual and more daring. I don't think that this was being reflected as much on the Wake Forest campus, but you may see a daring look here as this commencement image. I guess things got hot this year and people were covering their heads with whatever they could. And of course, what accessory matches the perfect hat is a Kodak Instamatic camera. Here we see two, and I believe in the previous image, he's also carrying his Instamatic camera. This impeccable mother of two ditched the hat for a sleeveless mod dress and perfectly coiffed hair. As you see here, she's got a great outfit. I am a mother of two, and I've never looked this turned out in my life, and I can't imagine I will. And doesn't she look gorgeous? Even as the decade marched on and rules and styles relaxed, women students were expected to wear a dress, hose, and heels on the upper quad. As Sarah mentioned, this entire presentation is focused on fashion. I did want to stop and say, in September of 1982, a Ghana native named Ed Reynolds, who graduated in 1964, became the first Black full-time undergraduate to enroll at Wake Forest. I'm speaking in very general terms about fashion during a time of unprecedented social and political and cultural change in America and on this campus. For the purposes of this presentation, we won't be able to discuss those topics, but I did want to include a picture of Ed Reynolds looking dapper in his 1962 suit. In March of 1963, 4 smart, clean-cut Wake Forest students captured the attention of campus and a large national following on the popular CBS quiz show, the GE College Bowl. I do want you to take a look at the 4 students on the left and how perfectly turned out they are in their 1963 garb. We'll visit 2 other decades of College Bowl members. So please remember this image because the image changes quite a bit as we get into the 70s and 80s. And here are some much talked about Bermudas. This is a picture from 1962 and when they opened Babcock Hall. Wake Forest co-eds, this is a quote from the Women's Handbook. Wake Forest co-eds usually wear Bermudas to lawn concerts, to Reynolda Gardens, and on picnics. Bermudas are not worn in any classroom building or on the upper campus. They can be worn across the street in front of the dorm only when going to a car. On Sunday, a raincoat must be worn with Bermudas. This rule applies to kilts, slacks, and Bermuda-length skirts and culottes. Here is the 1964-65 dress code from that year's Women's Handbook. So you can see putting together exactly what to wear to each event that you might be going to. Never is Bermudas listed on what you should wear, but there is, of course, a note on the bottom saying where Bermudas should not be worn. And if you were going to, I was going to say the movies, you're wearing your school clothes and loafers. All right, in 1968, women were allowed to wear slacks. The dress code changed in 1968. It was relaxed from allowing skirts and dresses only to permitting slacks on campus, but not to class. So as you saw, they talked about Bermudas quite a bit, but hadn't even mentioned slacks in any of the handbooks in the past. So it's very similar, but they're basically adding slacks as an option where slacks weren't even an option in the past. But it's under the same classification as Bermudas. You could wear them to lawn concerts and all the other places you might wear Bermudas, but not slacks, but not to class or on the upper quad. So this is a picture of 1969 Afro-American Society, which was founded that year. Many women were all becoming more casual in their day-to-day attire with the rise of athletic and leisure wear, ready to wear clothes and changing social norms. So here's a picture of the Afro-American Society founded by Howard Standback and Freeman Mark. At the time, a total of 33 members. The name was changed to the Black Student Alliance in 1983 and has since also changed names. So in 1969, the dress code was eliminated, and they just say that you are asked to use good taste in what you wear, both on and off campus. Sweatshirts and cutoffs are discouraged. Slacks and shorts are permitted for classes, but so you could wear them in classes at this point, but you were still asked to wear dresses around the administrative offices in Reynolda Hall. So this is 1969. So here's some women wearing dresses in the administrative offices and getting apparently quite a good cash bonus. And here are some students also wearing dresses in the administrative buildings and looking like extras from the Brady Bunch as we move into the 1970s. But as you can see, as reflected in the 1970 Howler, when they eliminated the dress code and suggested people look their best, this is what they were looking their best, but quite different from the no slacks without a raincoat rule that had just been changed the year before in 1968 when slacks made it to the list. Now they were very well accepted by the students. But there was still dressing in suits for big occasions, like when students buried this engine for the first Earth Day celebration in 1970. You can see the spectators in the background chose more informal and comfortable clothes to mark the occasion. So you see the 5 men in the front in their suits and loafers, but the students in the back you see lots of cutoff sweatshirts and jeans and t-shirts. So we've entered the 1970s and what FIT is describing as the polyester decade. As the swinging 60s turned into the 1970s, the influence of boutique stores and diffusion lines made ready-to-wear clothing increasingly accessible. New synthetic fabrics meant that fashionable styles could be bought at any price point. So pervasive were these materials that the 70s became known as the polyester decade. 70s fashion saw bold colors and patterns take center stage. Women's fashion looked back to the 1940s by day and pumped up the glamour by night. Men had an array of suit types to choose from and favored colorful plaids. So you see here's a whole family of 70s, and I believe this is our former president, Gerald Ford, and his family, whose son was at Wake Forest at the time. But you can see all the kids and the adults wearing some 70s styles. 1970s, men's fashion in the 1970s continued to get brighter and bolder. By the early 70s, the so-called peacock revolution that had started in the 1950s has made it acceptable for men to wear brighter colors, bolder prints, and wear their hair long. While the suit continued to be a staple for many men, new inventive styles were popularized. Not only were patterns a part of the landscape, students were trending towards more casual and comfortable clothing. So you obviously see patterns, but you see jeans and bell bottoms, sweatshirts, jackets, beanies. The students were looking more like the students we're used to today. You see more students, and as we move into the 80s on the right, we'll just do a few more slides of the 70s. So remember our 1962 College Bowl team. So this is the late 70s College Bowl. Things took a turn in the 70s when they took away dress code. This obviously was not on CBS, but it definitely shows how the students were dressing for the occasion. Just as women's wear saw a rise in athletic wear as leisure wear, so too did men's wear. Tracksuits and running shoes were worn as everyday casual wear. I also chose this image because of the epic shag carpet on the stairs that were present in every rec room in America at this time. I certainly remember it, and it really complements the look at the time. One more, a College Bowl. This is from the 80s. You see the Adidas sneakers and polo shirts that were popular casual and athletic wear during this time period. And as FIT says, later in the decade, hip hop and rap gave rise to its own style in the US. Groups such as Run DMC and the Beastie Boys led the way with their New York inspired look. Catherine Hennessy, who wrote Fashion, the Ultimate Book of Fashion and Style, says, these elements included old school white trainers by Adidas and Puma, distressed tapered jeans, preppy button down and polo shirts, nylon coach jackets, hooded sweatshirts, gold chains, and basketball caps worn at an angle. Run DMC embraced sportswear while the Beastie Boys layered jackets over tapered jeans. Adidas sneakers were worn by both and were especially popular. Their influence lasted throughout the end of the decade into the next and can still be felt today. As we move into the 80s, American designers such as Perry Ellis and Ralph Lauren turned to classic styles, menswear styles such as blazers, button-downs, and hand-knit sweaters to create casually elegant women's wear. These styles came to represent casual American style and were adopted as preppy style in the US, preppy referencing the elite preparatory schools attended by wealthy teens. And I thought this was just the perfect example of a Wake Forest preppy. And of course, one of the most enduring icons of the 80s style is Princess Diana, and this actually could be her if her hair were a little lighter. I thought this was such a great photo, really showing that 80s hairstyle and how people embraced her. In the 1980s, bigger meant better across the board in fashion, from women's shoulder pads to men's power suits to bold colors and patterns for men, women and children. There was nothing understated about fashion in the 80s. You see President Hearn and 4 of his student aides. These are some power suit dressing students and president. The final slide I will end with is, as the decade progressed, so-called power dressing became to dominate. This reflected a shift in women working in high-power positions and using fashion to be taken seriously. Padded shoulders and bold accessories made up this look. Here's an image of Germaine Bray. And if you don't know who she is, I find her bio to be the ultimate power woman and earns every shoulder pad and bold accessory that she can put on. So I'm just going to read that. Born in Paris, Germaine Bray grew up in the English-speaking Channel Islands. After graduating from the University of Paris, she taught in Algeria from 1932 to 1936. Appointed to teach at Bryn Mawr in 1936, she returned to France to fight for the Free French when World War II broke out. She joined a volunteer ambulance unit, rising to the rank of lieutenant, and was assigned to the intelligence section of the Free French in Algiers. She received a Bronze Star and was named to the Legion of Honor. At this time, Germaine Bray befriended Albert Camus. In 1953, she was appointed chair of the French department at NYU, and the second woman to be appointed chair at the university. From 1960 to 1970, she taught at University of Wisconsin, went on, and then in 1973 to 1984, she was Keenan Professor of Humanities at Wake Forest University. So quite a power woman in a power suit. And I will end on that. As I said, I stopped in the 80s because it was such a great time to stop, and the 90s seemed just too soon to reflect upon the fashion, even though the 90s fashion is coming back and the students on campus are dressing as if they were in college in the 90s. And that's my nod to Germaine Bray. I am going to stop sharing so that we can come, but this is the FIT. I will drop this in wherever I can drop it for you all to look at, but it's a really great timeline. Yes, Germaine Bray, yes. All righty, so if you have any questions, you're welcome to drop those in the chat. We also have a Q&A section. So I believe either one will work for questions for this. If anyone has questions, this has been recorded, so we will share it to everyone who's registered. And yeah. Lauren asked, was the preppy slide a photo in front of the library when it was on the 4th floor? I believe so, but I didn't investigate it too much. But let me see. We can investigate this as a group. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah, it looks like it. I can't think of any other building that would have that entrance. So yeah, it looks like that would be the library. And look at all that stack of books she's carrying. So we'll say it was the library. Okay, so we have a question on what was the name of the African American woman mentioned earlier? I believe that is the midwife that Sarah.
That's Ellen Lewis. Her name was Ellen Lewis.
Do you have her papers or?
Ellen, E-L-L-E-N. No, we don't have her. We don't have her papers. No, I mean, she's written about in the student magazine and the local newspaper from time to time. She lived to be 101. So there were lots of community celebrations every time she hit a milestone. But she died in 1945, I believe. And she still has descendants in Wake Forest that we've interviewed. We've interviewed her great granddaughter or
her granddaughter, Evelyn Jones, is a good friend of the museum and has done a number of things for us here. And the granddaughter is now in her late 80s.
Mm-hmm. She was delivered by Ellen, wasn't she? Yeah,
Yes,
she was what Ms. Lewis was called Mama Ellen or Aunt Ellen. She was known
And
as.
several of the Wake descendants that live here in Wake Forest, they were also delivered by Ellen Lewis.
I believe the question in the Q&A and the chat is the same question. What is year of twins at graduation? And then also what year was the turned out mother of two? I think you all both referencing the same photograph. And if you're not, you can follow up. But I dated it as 60s just based on that mod dress that the mother was wearing and her hair. It's not identified by year, which is the downside of photography or print photography. If you don't write on the back when it was and who it was and what year it was, it's only up to us to try to figure that out. With digital photography, at least you can have a stamp, a date on those, or most of the time. So I don't know the specifics. It might take some investigating to see if we can figure that out. But I imagine 60s. That's where I dated it, which was hard. A lot of the photos that I used they're just general campus photographs. And we were just like, is this late 50s, is it early 60s? Are we late 60s, early 70s? There's definitely some fluidity in the photos where I'm guessing of trends as we go or making an educated guess of trends as we go from one to the next. Oh, great. Cassandra Baker says perhaps she can identify for us and we'll check. That would be awesome. If you know who that woman is, tell her. She's gorgeous. All righty. If there's any other questions.
I might say while we're waiting for questions, Rebecca, that I'm surrounded by some of my fashionable friends here.
Oh, let's see.
We have Barbara Saunders Brown, who was a 1954 graduate and was the sister-in-law of Dickie Hemrick, who was the All-American basketball player for Wake Forest and held the national scoring record in basketball for 51 years. Right behind her is the cheerleader jacket of David Wilcox Sr., who was cheerleader from 1928 to 1930. Behind him is an outfit that was worn by Dr. Ed Wilson when he first came here to teach in the early 1950s. And then over my shoulder is the blazer and jacket and pants worn by one of the members of the Southerners, which was a very popular dance band, all Wake Forest College students. They were not allowed to play on this campus for dances because there was no dancing on this campus.
Yes, somebody asked if I could show the photo again of that woman with her children. So here it is. I mean, I love that photo. There she is. And I did want to drop the FIT. I'm going to stop sharing, but I'll drop that FIT link.
Yeah, if you're interested in fashion history, that timeline that she's going to share with you is really fascinating. There's some great photographs. Cassandra said she thinks it's 1970.
Okay. Yes, as I said, there's definitely some overlap.
She's going to check with that woman to see if she wants to be identified. If so, we could add it to the catalog information, right, Rebecca?
That's right. We will identify her.
And Kathy said, love all the outfits you chose to represent behind you, Ed. I can see Dr. Wilson wearing that outfit.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you all for joining us.
Yes,
You can follow up via email. We'll send this out when we get it available on the recording. And thank you for joining us.
Have a good one.